I think it's appropriate after what happened, the announcement this morning. It's a great announcement and long awaited that we talk a little bit about it. When President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement and pulled back the Clean Power Plant, we heard from the environmental extremists and the liberals declaring that the administration's actions, quoting now, they said, endangered public health, endangered our environment and our economic prosperity. That was Governors Brown and Cuomo. They further declared that if we don't decarbonize our future, people are going to die. People are always going to die. That's what the extremists always say. And I guess there must be a population out there that actually believes that. However, the opposite is happening without a one-sided international agreement or the punishing Clean Power Plan in effect. In 2017, the United States led the world in CO2 reductions, while China and India led the world in increasing CO2 emissions. How many people know that? Because all you ever hear about is that we are the guilty one over here in terms of our emissions. That's not true at all. I mean, just think, China and India both led the world in increasing CO2 emissions. Now, these are the guys that our previous president, President Obama, would have us believe actually were making great sacrifices. And here they are leading in increasing CO2 emissions. When we passed tax reform, the Democrats claimed we would experience Armageddon. That was Nancy Pelosi, and the tax increase would be on middle-class families. As we've seen, tax reform has been a resounding success with 4% unemployment and nearly 4.1 GDP growth in the last quarter. The Washington Post, now this is right after Congressman Pelosi made the statement about the taxes would increase on all American families. The Washington Post fact-checks the Democrat claims, giving them 4 Pinocchios, as 80% of middle-class families are paying less taxes. In other words, 80% of the families, middle-class families, are paying less taxes now than they were. And yet she was saying that all middle class were going to have to increase. So, you hear these things. You can't look at success and see what's happened and really appreciate it without rousing everyone on the other side with extreme accusations. And with every executive order and Congressional Review Act resolution that rolled back burdensome regulations after burdensome regulation, we heard that the end of the days were coming. Now, let's pause for a minute here and see how you get rid of some of these regulations. There are two ways of getting rid of regulations. One is you do it with an executive order. Sometimes that doesn't work. You can't use an executive order in certain types of regulations, so you have to go with the Congressional Review Act. It's kind of interesting because we started the Congressional Review Act 20 years ago, and it only prior to this administration been used successfully once in 20 years. Now it happens almost every day. And with every executive order and Congressional Review Act resolution, rolling back the regulations, we heard that the end of the world was coming. You would not know if you looked at the economy and see that the increases in energy production, manufacturing, consumer confidence, GDP, and job opportunities of what's happening in this country today. Meanwhile, jobless claims dropped to a near 45-year low. 45-year low of jobless claims this year. And the Social Security disability claims last year were the lowest we've seen since 2002. I think it's kind of interesting to go back and look at the fact that we have 4% unemployment. I've always considered, and for as long as I can remember, 4% unemployment is full employment. That's if there's always going to be some unemployables, but 4% is considered to be full employment, and that's what we have. It's kind of interesting. I was in Texas last week and talking to one of my liberal friends down there, and I was talking about what can you say now? I mean, look at the economy. The economy's never been better. And he said, no, the economy's bad. He said, it's hard to find anyone to work in restaurants anymore. In other words, we have full employment, but that's supposed to be bad. So anyway, we are at that position right now. The growth, 4.1% growth in the economy in the last quarter. Let's stop and think about that. This is something no one disagrees with. For every 1% growth in economic activity, that translates into $2.9 trillion of new income coming into the federal government every 10 years. Now, let's stop and think about it. We have a president who's trying to undo the damage from the last administration when the military was cut to the bone, and we didn't do anything in the way of infrastructure. This president is committed to that, and people are saying, all right, where's the money going to come from? There's where it's going to come from. My gosh, if we can average just 3% of growth, and we've been doing that, we're far exceeding that, that's going to be close to $6 trillion of new funding that will be there in the next administration. So with each action the president takes, we hear that the consequences will be dire and that people would die. It's always that people would die. And yet those predictions are never materialized. We've seen the opposite happen. When it comes to President Trump's pick to replace Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court, the predictions are just as historical. Now, if there's not any logical reason to be against something, just start name calling, and that's what's been happening. In a recent speech, Hillary Clinton worried that with the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, Republicans, quote, want to turn the clock back to the 1850s. That came from Hillary Clinton. Her meaning was very clear. She wants people to believe that Judge Kavanaugh and the Republicans are taking the country back to the days of slavery, despite no evidence to back up this reckless claim. In fact, Republicans want more freedom, not less. Others are equally as bold in their predictions in saying that his confirmation will be the death, listen to this, the death of millions. His confirmation will be the destruction of the Constitution. His confirmation will usher in the end of civil rights in America and make us complicit in evil. In other words, it would be the death of millions of Americans who logically can even look at that without smiling and saying they have to be totally just desperate in what the accusations they make on this guy. So with all these baseless extreme attacks on his nomination, it means just one thing: Brett Kavanaugh is an excellent pick for the Supreme Court. After meeting with him last week and looking into his record and reading about his character, some of the stories that I've heard from other people, it's clear that he's a solid choice to become our newest Supreme Court justice. With 12 years on the D.C. Court of Appeals, Judge Kavanaugh has amassed a record of over 300 opinions, and the worst opposition research we can have seen against him so far is that he charged baseball tickets to his credit card and then paid for them. So by all accounts from those who know him, Brett Kavanaugh is a respected member of his community and of his profession. Professionally, he's known as a serious jurist who studies the law and is even-handed in applying the law. In his op-ed for the New York Times, it was entitled, "A Liberal's Case for Brett Kavanaugh," Yale law professor Akhil Reed Amar made the statement, and this is a quote. He said, "Good appellate judges faithfully follow the Supreme Court. Great ones influence and help steer it," referring to Kavanaugh. By this measure, Judge Kavanaugh has been a great appellate judge. He ranks second among the current judges who have law clerks who have gone on to clerk for the United States Supreme Court. More impressively, the Supreme Court has agreed with the positions that Judge Kavanaugh has made in his last 13 of his opinions, adopting his logic in the prevailing opinion before the court. In other words, they fell down on his side in the cases that he had made. In the last 13 of his opinions. 9 of those times, the Supreme Court has adopted his dissenting opinions as their majority opinion. In fact, he's only been reversed by the Supreme Court just once, and only in part. Of those Judge Kavanaugh dissenting opinions, the Supreme Court adopted as their own. One of them includes his dissent in Coalition for Responsible Regulations versus the EPA. in which he concluded that the EPA defined air pollution too broadly in its regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. He viewed the Obama EPA's burdensome greenhouse gas regulations for power plants as exceeding its authority and argued that the court should not lightly conclude that the Congress intended to impose enormous costs on tens of thousands of American businesses with corresponding effects on American jobs and workers. Again, the Supreme Court agreed with him. They're on his side. This opinion is also instructive to see his thinking on the proper role of the courts in our system of government. In his opinion, he wrote, as, quote, "As a court, it is not our job to make the policy choices and set the statutory boundaries, but to emphatically our job it is to carefully and firmly enforce the statutory boundaries." And this is a consistent part of his jurisprudence. Because of his position on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Kavanaugh has had many opportunities to check federal government's overreach. You know, I served as chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee for quite a number of years, and one of the big problems we had at that time was the bureaucrats were actually making the determinations. And this is something that he has actually overruled the bureaucracy many times. In fact, he has overruled the federal agency action 75 times in his 12 years on the bench. That's really saying something. And when the EPA wanted to impose massive emissions regulations but did not want to consider the cost, Judge Kavanaugh rejected that effort in White Stallion Energy Center versus EPA. The Supreme Court agreed. The EME Homer City generation versus EPA, in that case, Judge Kavanaugh held that the Obama EPA's cross-state air pollution rule was unlawful and imposed excessive regulatory burdens on the states. He also rejected the Department of Interior's position to designate 143 acres of plaintiff's property as critical habitat for a shrimp based on a single 2001 sighting of 4 ant-sized San Diego ferry shrimp on the property. They would shut that down. He reversed it. These are just a few examples of Judge Kavanaugh's efforts to ensure that our agencies are acting and regulating with their authorizing statutes in the U.S. Constitution. And this is the real reason why we're seeing such a vitriol from the left. They have long used our courts and our agencies to impose their unpopular agenda, mostly because they couldn't get it through Congress, as a majority of Americans recognize how stifling and burdensome the agenda is. Well, having another judge on the Supreme Court that recognizes the proper role of the courts and the agencies when it comes to setting policy that affects all Americans and threatens their ability to force costly, ineffective, unpopular burdens on our economy, our job producers, and our landowners. With Judge Kavanaugh on the court, we will preserve the U.S. Constitution and our system of representative government for decades to come. As I told Brett in our meeting, he's been good enough to go around to have meetings with all the members of the Senate. In fact, I had told him from his reputation he didn't need to waste his time meeting with me because I knew all about him and I was going to support him. As I told him during that meeting, though, and his nomination and the work that President Trump and the Senate have done to process judicial nominations are to save our country, not for me, but for my 20 kids and grandkids. So I look forward to the confirmation. We're going to hear more of the accusations, more of the extreme left making comments about this great judicial success. And I look forward to having him there for many years to come, and I'm convinced that that's going to happen. With that, I yield the floor.